Welcome to everybody to the July edition of the Manuscript Society's Manuscript Mondays with Peter Klarnet of Christie's Auction Houses. Let me tell you a little bit about the Manuscript Society. The mission of the Manuscript Society is to encourage the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents to stimulate and aid collectors in their various collecting specialties and facilitate the exchange of information among collectors, scholars, and dealers. It was founded in 1948, and it included just collectors in the beginning, but it has come to be to include curators, librarians, dealers, auction houses, and members from around the world. The Manuscript Society publishes a quarterly journal and a quarterly newsletter. It also offers a scholarship program, the Richard Moss Research Grant. It's available next spring. Check the Manuscript Society website for more information. And finally, we have an annual meeting for members. This past year was in New York City. We saw some great behind the scenes stuff. And this upcoming year will be in Boston. So keep an eye out and check it out. It's a great organization to belong to. Without further ado, I want to introduce Peter Klarnet. And he will be coming to us tonight talking about a couple documents related to New York City history. You can ask them at the end by putting them in the chat. You can go live. So there's anything basically, if you have any information you want to follow up on, you can ask Peter at the end. But he's going to be talking about New York City has always been the place of diverse peoples and opinions. He'll explore the stories of two individuals, Anthony Janszoon van Salee, believed to be the first Muslim to settle in what is now the United States, and Samuel Jones, a former Loyalist who was a key figure in New York State's ratification of the Constitution. So, without further ado, Peter, why don't you take us away?
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Peter Klarnet. I'm a senior specialist at the Books and Manuscripts Department at Christie's, New York, but I'm with my hat as vice president of the Manuscript Society. I've now lived in New York for the majority of my life, and wherever I have lived, I've always become very intrigued and interested in the history of where I live. And New York City is one of the most fascinating places on the planet. Um, and I've always been very, very interested in the early history of the city because, in so many ways, what happens in New York happens in America. New York is an extraordinary, diverse, polyglot place, a melting pot, very much in the spirit of what we know of the United States to be today. So today I'm going to talk about, as Jay mentioned, two different stories that I discovered going through historical manuscripts: Anthony Janszoon van Salee and Samuel Jones. So, beginning with the first manuscript, I encountered this back in around 2018. Consigner brought it to me, and they knew very, very little about it. They knew it was from the early 1640s. It seemed to be from New Amsterdam, but that's all they had. And I looked at this thing, and I looked at this thing, and my eyes started to get crossed. I could not read this to save my life. I looked and I looked and I couldn't see this, I couldn't see that. So we couldn't figure out what the signature was. Went on the back, and there's some more writings. Most of it's faded out. We were very difficult trying to make that out, but we did see this, which happens to be Peter Stuyvesant's signature. Apparently, Peter Stuyvesant signed this document sometime after its execution in the late 1640s, after he arrived to replace Wilhelm Kieft, who was the governor of New Netherland, who very famously got the colony embroiled in a war against Lenni Lenape. That's the reason the wall was erected on Wall Street, and the very sour state of European native relations in the lower Hudson Valley. But unfortunately, this wasn't enough to find. Just, okay, so we have a Peter Stuyvesant signature, but what does this mean? Why is this document interesting? Why should we care? Well, fortunately, although we couldn't read it, there has been a person by the name of Charles Gehrig up in Albany, New York, for the past 50 years. has been translating the Dutch records of New York City. He had something, he was until just this spring when he retired after 50 years, he was heading up the New Netherland Institute, which is part of the New York State Library in Albany. And I encourage everybody to consult this site. They have searchable transcriptions, imagery, and they're always doing more and more and more with these very, very valuable and precious records of New Netherland, many of which were actually lost during a fire in 1911. So many of the records that they had to go through were severely damaged by fire and then, of course, by water. Um, the one other thing that we were able to read on this document, fortunately, was the date. And as you can see here, it is the 27th of May in the year 1643. And so we plug this date into their database, and as it happens, only one thing happened in New Netherland on this day in 1643, and a grant, and there was a land grant, and it was issued to by William Kieft, and that we could see his name at the very top. And they say on basically this document is testifying on August 13, 1639, we have given and granted to Anthony Janszoon van Salee 100 morgens of land lying on the North River upon Long Island opposite Coney Island, which we know today as Coney Island. This grant opens up a whole can of worms about early New York, early settlement, and what it meant to be a New Yorker. And of course, this name, Anthony Janszoon van Salee, proved enormously fascinating. He was an early settler to New York. He came here circa 1630. He was the son of Janzoon van Haarlem, or Jan Janzoon from Haarlem in the Netherlands. He was born in 1570. He became a sailor and apparently was a privateer for the Netherlands, raiding Spanish shipping in the Atlantic and in the far west of the Mediterranean. And as happens with many privateers, sometimes there's not enough Spanish vessels to go around, so they go around and raiding other vessels from other countries, and that's when you go from the very fine line from privateering to piracy. Apparently, when he wasn't raiding Spanish ships, he would lower down his tricolor Dutch flag and put up a flag of Algiers. And he eventually began sailing for various Barbary states on the North African coast. In sometime before around 1700, he married a Moorish woman from Cartagena. We believe she was what was known as a converso, or somebody who nominally converted to Christianity to escape the Spanish Inquisition. But as the Inquisition's as the Inquisition's grip tightened on Spain, even these nominal Christians started fleeing Spain. And Jan van Zoom and his wife eventually migrated to a city called Salie, which is on the north coast of Africa, just north of the city of Rabat in modern day Morocco. And around that time, there's a view of the main gate to Salie. And around 1609, he gave birth to his fourth son, Anthony Janzoon van Salee. We believe he was born either in Salie or maybe in Cartagena. So the records of this are unfortunately fuzzy, and we're dealing with a lot of conflicting accounts about his origins. We do know that by 1620, Anthony, actually around 1630, Anthony had shown up in Amsterdam and boarded a ship bound for New Netherland, where he landed either around 1629 or 1630. Again, we're dealing with many, many contradictory accounts. He either 2 days before he sailed from Amsterdam or soon after his arrival in New Amsterdam, he met Griet or Gries Reniers, who was about 7 or 8 years his senior. She worked in a tavern in Amsterdam, was apparently let go for her own sort of moonlighting, which you might be able to guess involved affairs with other men. She was possibly a prostitute. That is not her pictured on the left, but that is a painting from the period. She was written up by others as they called her the first lady of the night, whose scandalous conduct in the New Amsterdam in the 1630s was written up in official records of the time. Now, whether she was or was not a practicing prostitute in New Netherlands is unclear. Most of the people who complained of her conduct had long-running feuds with her, and some of them were even known to be drunks or liars. But as the story goes, her and her husband, Anthony Van Salee, or known locally as Anthony the Turk, were a notorious couple. They quarreled with their neighbors, often visibly drunk in the streets. At one point, his wife accused the Dominique Bogardus, the Dutch Reform minister in New Amsterdam's wife, of soliciting prostitution herself. To her defense, Bogardus's wife Anna said, "No, I had only lifted my skirt slightly to get over a very muddy puddle and not to soil my dress." This goes on for several years, and by 1639, it seems that many residents in the fledgling settle of New Amsterdam have had more than enough of this gentleman, and they banish him. They banish him from a farm that he had established just outside of the walls, around what's now modern Maiden Lane, and said he had to go to Brooklyn. This is actually here you can see an imagined photo of Dominique Bogardus, who was Anthony Van Salee's main foe, and some also accused of also being a drunk. So the punishment for all these infractions and being a nuisance to the town was to be banished from New Netherland, which essentially meant you had to leave the island of Manhattan in 1639. And so he was actually sent. He actually left, and then soon afterwards was actually granted land. Although he was banished, he was granted land, and you can see here on this line it says off Long Island, Deers, and Coney Island. And you can see down here on this map, you can see down on the lower right, you can see just at the shore, which is a neighborhood known in Brooklyn as Gravesend, which is just to the north of Coney Island. And to the left, you can see a detail of that of that of that shoreline. So up here is Gravesland, and down here is the sandbar that is now today known locally as Coney or Rabbit Island. And in this map, which has actually which has been lovingly restored by the municipal archives in the city of New York, this is from actually a 1788 property dispute. But you can see at the right, they actually identify Anthony Janszoon van Salee's house, or where it was formerly. And what also makes this document extraordinarily interesting is we believe it's the first manuscript reference to Coney Island. So not only does this document concern the first person who's believed to have been a Muslim resident of New York City and what became the United States, but the first reference to Coney Island in manuscript. We had the pleasure of offering this at auction in 2018 at Christie's, where it sold on a very conservative estimate for $27,000, and it was actually became part of the Brooklyn Historical Society, which is now over at the Brooklyn Public Library, and is now part of their permanent collections. So we go from the 17th century now to very unusual story to the 18th century, and this one we encountered just last year. It is what is a manuscript of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is a very unusual manuscript for a few different reasons, and we'll go through them somewhat deliberately so you can get an idea of what's going on here. First of all, if you're looking at this illustration, it doesn't even look anything like the Declaration of Independence, because it's not. It's actually the New York State Constitution of 1777. When you start reading the New York State Constitution of 1777, you notice about a page in that we get to the bottom here. You say, oh, Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands. And it goes on. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal. And as it happens, this document transcribes the entirety of the Declaration of Independence. Now, why does it do this? There's no other state constitution written during the American Revolution that does this, but here it is. And part of the reason comes to actually the story of the passage of the Declaration of Independence, which, as if many of you know, was not voted for by New York State. When Congress brought a motion for independence to the vote on July 2nd, 1776, the New York delegation did not have authorization to do so. And interestingly enough, they were already acting on this because in May of 1776, the Continental Congress had asked the colonies to basically cease being governed by committees of safety, committees of correspondence, and actually form real governments with real constitutions. And when the New York Provincial Congress, which was a legislative body that was operating in opposition to the royal government, received this instruction, they determined they did not have authorization from their voters to authorize such a move, which was almost tantamount to independence at that point. So they called for new provincial elections. By the time we roll around to July 2nd, 1776, those elections had just happened. Those delegates had not assembled anywhere. So New York basically sat on its hands. 2 days later, the text of the Declaration of Independence is put forth put before the Continental Congress. And there too, New York can't vote. So the text of the Declaration of Independence is voted unanimously by the other 12 colonies, printed by John Dunlap on the night of the 4th and 5th of 1776, and this news begins to spread. A Dunlap broadside arrives in New York on July 9th, 1776. Um, the New York Provincial Congress had been meeting in the city, but by this point, the word on the street was that the British, who had just evacuated Boston in March of 1776, were sailing a huge fleet and army towards New York to take the city. So by this point, the New York Provincial Congress, the new New York Provincial Congress, is meeting in White Plains, New York. They receive the text of the Declaration of Independence in the morning. They review it. They vote unanimously to vote it to endorse it. And you can see here on the third page on the right here, it says, and whereas this convention, having taken this declaration into its most serious consideration, did on the 9th day of July last pass unanimously resolved that the reasons assigned by the Continental Congress for declaring the United Colonies free and independent states are cogent and conclusive, and that while we lament the cruel necessity which has rendered that measure unavoidable, we approve the same and will, at the risk of our lives and our fortunes, join the other colonies in supporting it. At noon, the provincial congress adjourned, and after lunch, they reconvened as a constitutional convention. And for the next 7 months, the New York Provincial Congress started to get into constitution writing. Now, meanwhile, there is a war going on. John Jay, who is one of the principal movers behind this constitution, is also busy on a committee trying to get a chain made to try to block British shipping across the Hudson River, trying to get more troops to New York City to defend the town. So there's a lot going on. So it's not until May of 1777 that a constitution for the state of New York is finalized. Now, what's interesting about this, they actually take a draft. Actually, I'm going to move a step ahead. Their purpose is actually to publish, publish this in pamphlet form to spread to give to county commissioners and town mayors and governments so they can actually start implementing this government. The manuscript that Congress that the New York Provincial Congress approved is missing. We don't know what happened. We believe it went to the printer, Samuel Loudon in Fishkill, and was probably destroyed in the printing process. What survives today in in the state of New York's archives is this incomplete draft, which actually incorporates part of the resolve of New York of the Continental Congress for state first colonies to actually begin forming constitutions. You can see on the next oops, you can see on the next image some of the editing that's going on, but to show that this was the only copy they had left, Leonard Gansevoort, the president, actually signs this document. And so this, as far as we know, this was the earliest one they have, and it's incomplete. The document I just showed you previously is the earliest complete manuscript of the New York State Constitution known. But it wasn't written in 1776. It was not written in 1777. It was probably written circa 1786. Now, why in the world would we care about a document, a transcription of the Declaration of Independence, or the New York State Constitution for that matter, in 1786? Well, it comes down to this little book, because this manuscript was found bound with this book. And this book belonged to a gentleman by the name of Samuel Jones, whose book plate sat in the paste down. So, who is Samuel Jones? Well, Samuel Jones is my favorite New Yorker now, for a lot of reasons, and it's not just because he's an adorable little guy. If you look at him, I find him, he looks very meek. You look at all these founding fathers, and they have these really fierce looks on their faces. He's very heroic. Here's this really mild mannered, gentleman, and he was a lawyer. He was a career lawyer. He was born in Oyster Bay, um, in 1734. Um, in 1760, he began working in the law offices of William Smith, and in October that year, he was admitted to the New York bar. He was a very well respected jurist. And you might know him best from the street downtown, probably better known by its most famous resident, Jean Michel Basquiat, but Great Jones Street. This was actually property from his holdings, and it was actually named after him. You might also know his second wife, Cornelia. As you can see there, her Cornelia Street still survives in the West Village. Now, Samuel Jones is a very interesting character in that he was a supporter. He was an early supporter of the American Revolution. We know he was a member of a committee convened in 1775 in New York City. It was called the Committee of 60. And the Committee of 60 was there to enforce non importation measures enacted by the First Continental Congress in 1774. However, in the following year, after the eruption of hostilities at Lexington and Concord, Jones was nominated to join the Committee of 100, which was a more radical body. He declined to join, and he became a nominal loyalist. He stayed in New York after the British invaded the city in August, September of 1776, and from what we understand, remained there probably until the end of the war, at least until 1779 or 1780. However, even though he was a loyalist, we don't know him ever necessarily swearing an oath of allegiance to the king, and nor was his property confiscated, as many loyalist New Yorkers were by the New York state government during the American Revolution. Um, and after the war, he actually emerges as a very powerful and important figure in New York state government, the only loyalist to do so. Now, why was this? There's probably a few reasons. One of which is that Samuel Jones did not take up arms against against the Continental Congress or George Washington. He was now outspoken in his views. And in 1779, he had a farm in Queens County that was confiscated by the British authorities. Now, why was that? Well, he actually bought it from a Whig or a rebel who was leaving New York just before the invasion. But because the mortgage happened to be in the name of a rebel, the British authorities confiscated the farm from him. He was out an entire farm that he'd worked for years to improve. So this may have turned the tide for Samuel Jones. And as I mentioned before, after the war, he emerges as a very important New York State politician. In 1784, he's actually nominated to a committee that included Alexander Hamilton to negotiate a disputed boundary between New York State and Massachusetts. In 1786, he is also elected to the Continental Congress. He does not join because he's also elected to the New York State Assembly. And in January of 1787, Samuel Jones actually he actually um, puts forth the first legislative Bill of Rights, and it was the first one, first legislative Bill of Rights passed, I believe, in any state, and it actually still remains on the books today. But this, of course, none of this really answers why in the world did he take his time to copy an entirety of the New York State Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Why did he do this? Well, um, we're not exactly sure, but the circumstances would may have been for the fact that he was also assigned to revise the laws of the state of New York with Richard Varick. And that actually was a volume that was put out in 1789. Now, the reason they were doing this is they were charged to revise all of the statutes that were on the book before 1776 and to harmonize them with New York state law and American law and find obsolete legislation. And here you see a picture of one that was issued in 1789. This copy is courtesy of the dealer David Lesser. You can find it. It's actually on sale on his website. And there's my little plug. Um, Now, in the laws of the state of New York, in the volume that he was working on, we could just go back a couple of slides here. The laws of the state of New York from 1782, which is revising. You can go through the margins and you'll see that he was commenting on various laws and what have you. So it may have been that he was doing this for that purpose, and maybe it was supposed to be a publisher's copy. But when we look in the 1789 volume, none of the marginal notes and paragraph notes match up at all. So that didn't seem to make any sense. So why else would he be using this? Well, the following year, after the passage, after he introduces this legislative Bill of Rights in the New York State Assembly, he is elected by his by the citizens of Queens County to represent the county in the New York State Ratification Convention that was there to consider and possibly ratify the new federal Constitution of 1787. That body met in June, July of 1788, at about the same time that Virginia was also doing its consideration. This was a very, this is the close of the ratification process, but New York State and Virginia are probably the most important colonies to actually to join the Union. So their ratification is going to be particularly important. Now, politically, Samuel Jones was a member of the George Clinton faction, and that is the embryonic Democratic, Republican, Jeffersonian faction that develops in the 1790s and 1800s, as opposed to the federal faction, people like John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. So he is coming in to the convention as an anti-federalist, and this is a big, but by the time they're getting around to actually ratifying, 8 states have already ratified, and I believe by the time both conventions had, within a couple of weeks, New Hampshire had ratified. Now, 9 states had ratified the Constitution, and it's essentially in force. But it's not going to be much of a constitution without states of New York and Virginia. And there's actually correspondence going on back and forth between the anti-federalist factions in Richmond, Virginia, and in New York, and Poughkeepsie, New York, debating what they should do, because the anti-federalists were their chief criticism of the federal constitution was that there is no Bill of Rights, none whatsoever. And they wanted something incorporated. They were actually calling for a second constitutional convention. So in both Virginia and New York's um, uh, ratifications, they were actually proposing that that we would only ratify this on condition that a new convention be convened and new rights be incorporated within the text of the Constitution. This is something that Madison in Virginia and Hamilton in New York both thought was absolute disaster. It's a lot of back and forth, a lot of a lot of pressure being put on Sam Jones. Um, but it's interesting. It's actually his wife who writes to him in early 1788 and says, "You're not going to make New York the last state to ratify this, are you? That would just be ridiculous. The momentum's there. We have to do this." But Sam Jones is an anti-federalist. He's in a very very difficult position. So towards the end of the convention, he breaks the logjam, and what he does is he makes a motion that the ratification be approved, not on condition that this happen or the Bill of Rights be incorporated, but in full confidence that the Bill of Rights be incorporated. And that got the two votes to get the Constitution over the top in New York State. And a very, very similar thing happened in Virginia. He got a lot of fallout from this. He was accused as as a traitor by many of his political supporters. But that doesn't ruin his political career. He's got new political friends. Now he's an intimate of John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. In 1790, he becomes the state's first comptroller. Later, has a long career as a reporter, and then quickly fell into relative historical obscurity. So we had a lot of fun with this document. We were working with Dr. John Kaminsky at the Center for the Study of the Constitution, who's done so much remarkable work on the ratification project, and he was really thrilled by Sam Jones's story, and he actually noticed something very interesting, pointed out about the New York State Constitution itself, in that, ironically, the New York State Constitution was very much one of the models that James Madison used when he proposed the federal Constitution. New York's Constitution had three branches, all independent. The only major differences were for appointments. They had something called a Council of Appointments, which was a mixed body between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary to do things like that. But it really brings full circle the idea of, as New York goes, so goes the country. Even political factions. Um, uh, the framers of the Constitution were. Uh, we laugh at them today, thinking their ideal was that this would be a republic of virtuous gentlemen running a republic with no parties, no interests. And I wish I could find it again, but Samuel Jones actually made a fairly biting an acerbic address about this, because in New York, political parties have been a fact of life since the 17th century. From the days of Anthony van Salée's days, there were factions. So, I mean, to him, the idea that government would operate, without political parties, without interest groups, was utterly ridiculous. And he was really, in so many ways, while he was very mild mannered, very quiet, he was an immensely practical individual, and tells us so much about our early days in New York State. So those are my two stories of fairly obscure New Yorkers that I discovered through manuscripts, and the stories that they reveal. So at this point, Jay, I think we can open this up for questions.
Yeah, the first one I've got, Peter, is did you have other handwriting of Samuel Jones so you knew that he's the one that actually wrote that?
Yes. The New York Public Library has a very extensive collection of his papers. And yeah, so we were actually able to match up the handwriting perfectly.
Nice. Well, that was excellent presentation, Peter. Nice to see the two different connections in New York City and stuff like that. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Peter? We've got plenty of time. Here's one right here.
Yeah.
Roger Moore said, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. And if you want to speak, ask Peter a question live, just let Lee and I know and we can put your video on. Now, Peter, I know you're not necessarily able to share, but where'd the second
Mm.
document go?
Well, it went to a private collector.
Okay.
It sold, yeah, and it sold for $2.4 million. Because, and the reason it sold for so much is that manuscript declarations of independence, while actually quite common, because where you see them most often are in town books of New England, of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, where very often the town clerks were ordered to transcribe them from the actual broadsides, but those never come up on the market. And going through every record we could find, this turned out to be the only near contemporary manuscript of the Declaration of Independence in private hands. But we do hope to see this on public display soon. I
Good.
believe it might be loaned out, and we'll put up an announcement through the Manuscript Society News when that happens.
Nice. Here's a question from Brad Cook regarding the portrait of Jones. What do you know about it? He looks very young. He looks about 10 years old.
I know, doesn't he look like a little kid, doesn't he? We don't know a lot about this. This is a, and it's a photo. It's a little, it's on a little carte visite that's owned by the New York Society Library. But we don't know anything about the artist or how it was made, or even when, when this was actually this is probably photographed mid-century, but we have no idea what happened to the original.
And what was it? Another question from Brad. What was the name of the man that did the translating at the New Netherlands Institute?
Oh, that is Charles Gehrig, the recently retired Charles Gehrig.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about him if you can.
He was studying German and Dutch languages, and in the mid '60s, and I think he finished his PhD work at Indiana, if I'm not mistaken, Brad. And he was one of those people who just didn't want to he just didn't look like the prospect of academia and the whole parish or publish scene. And I think an ad for this position came up right around the same time he had gotten his PhD, and he got the interview, took the job, and he never looked back. And God bless him, he did. He's done wonderful work.
Yeah, that's great. Question from Jim Goldman. How did you determine that Van Soon was Muslim?
Well, we don't know if he was actually a practicing Muslim. We know about his father. We know he sailed for Algiers. We and there's actually a family tradition that there was a Quran in the family. Now, one thing I neglected to add, to the Van Salees, um, by the 1650s, 70s, Van Salee was actually a very, very prominent New Yorker. When he died, he had four daughters, all of which married into fairly prominent families. And one of those daughters married into the family that would come to be known as the Vanderbilts. So Cornelius Vanderbilt can count as an ancestor. Anderson Cooper can count as an ancestor as well. But we don't know if he actually practiced Islam. That will probably never be known.
A question from Ravi Gul. Excellent talk. Has AI or Chat GPT or other technologies help you to transcribe the documents or add to your research?
No, no, not a lick. All the transcriptions for the Dutch things have been done with people, eyes, and brains. And the Samuel Jones declaration is actually a pretty easy read. His handwriting was great.
Do you expect to see a lot of stuff like this, more and more stuff like this come out as people realize the importance of what they might have in manuscript?
Um, I I would hope so. I would hope so. I think we're starting to discover some of the more, maybe the less obvious things about our country's past, which I think people are becoming more engaged in. You always get the headline stories. Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson. But then these are people who are really on the ground and making a huge impact as well.
Great. Any other questions for Peter? Okay. Without any more questions, thank you very much. In August, there'll be more information coming, but Dr. Ravi Goel will be talking. He's a new member of the Manuscript Society, so say hello to him. And Peter, I want to thank you very much for your talk. Next time you
Absolutely, thank
find
you.
another cool documents like this, let us know, and we'll bring you back for another session.
Yeah, we're working on some fun stuff right now, so stay tuned.
Right. Okay. Have a good evening, everybody. Enjoy
Thank you
your
very much.
the rest of your evening out there. Hopefully, it's not too warm where you are, and anybody in Texas is safe.
Yeah,
Take care, everybody.
indeed. Take care. Good night.